Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Stealth, The Secret Contest to Invent Invisible Aircraft, by Peter Westwick, narrated by David Vries. Introduction. On a moonless night in January 1991, a dozen aircraft appeared in the skies over Baghdad. Or, rather, didn't appear. The airplanes arrived in the dark, their black outlines cloaking them from sight. More importantly, their odd, angular shapes, which made them look like flying origami, rendered them virtually invisible to Iraq's formidable air defense radars. The aircraft were F-117As, better known as the Stealth Fighter, and they were part of the opening salvo of Operation Desert Storm, the international effort led by U.S. forces to reverse Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. American television viewers were transfixed by video footage of F-117s dropping laser-guided bombs down the air shafts of Baghdad buildings. No stealth aircraft were lost in the Gulf War. The technology behind the F-117 and the similarly stealthy B-2 bomber marked a military breakthrough. The F-117 is more than 60 feet long and 40 feet across, but to radar, it looks as small as a ball bearing. The far larger B-2 has the radar footprint of a frisbee. Just as remarkable, Stealth's inventors at two different aerospace firms wound up with contrasting airplanes. Just look at the two planes and the differences are apparent. On the one hand, the sharply angular F-117, on the other, the smoothly rounded B-2. Why is one stealth plane angular and the other curved? The answer to that simple question reveals several tensions at the core of this story. Between the two companies, Lockheed and Northrop. Between the disciplines of radar physics and aeronautical engineering. And between design philosophies, especially involving the role of computers versus human intuition in aircraft design. These tensions played out in an exceptional cast of characters, from bookish engineers to jovial pranksters to hard-driving managers. This book is about where those aircraft came from and why they look the way they do. It tells the story of engineers at Lockheed and Northrop and their epic contest to build these two planes, a competition conducted under the highest levels of secrecy in the Cold War. In a fantastically fertile 5-year period in the mid to late 1970s, engineers at the two firms arrived at different solutions to achieve the same breakthrough, aircraft essentially invisible to radar. There is a tendency in military history to view a new technology as a deus ex machina. A new weapon, the longbow at the Battle of Agincourt, the machine gun in the First World War, and perhaps the greatest deus ex machina of them all, the atomic bomb in the Second World War, suddenly appears on the scene and revolutionizes warfare. But where did the technology come from? Why did it appear at that particular time? Why did one side get it and not another? In short, how did it come to be? These questions are often ignored because military history tends to tell stories either from the top down, the president's and general's view of grand strategy, or from the bottom up, the trench-level view of the combat soldier. There is another view, between that of the general's genius and the soldier's courage, what the historian Paul Kennedy has called history from the middle, the story of the engineers and mid-level military officers who champion new military technologies. In Kennedy's case, it was the engineers who turned the tide in World War II with the P-51 Mustang, anti-submarine warfare, amphibious assault, and anti-tank weapons. Similarly, stealth originated with engineers at Lockheed and Northrop and won the backing of technical program managers in the military long before either generals or frontline soldiers knew about it. That is not to say that these engineers always agreed. However fierce the competition was between the two firms, the technical battles within the firms were as fierce or even fiercer. Stealth, in other words, was a contest on three levels, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, between Lockheed and Northrop, and within Lockheed and Northrop. An early British airplane builder, Howard Theophilus Wright, no relation to the American brothers, declared in 1912, The successful aeroplane, like many other pieces of mechanism, is a huge mass of compromise. He did not, however, suggest how engineers might reach compromise. On a typical day in the Advanced Design Department of Northrop in Hawthorne in the mid-1970s, engineers in their offices would lift their heads from their work like startled animals as the shouted arguments of John Cashin and Irv Walland, Northrop's principal stealth designers, shattered the tranquility. Cashin and Walland would have been comforted and probably not surprised to learn that 20 miles away in Burbank, similar arguments echoed down the hallways of Lockheed. The popular image of the aerospace engineer is rational, dispassionate, and reserved. These engineers were certainly rational, but not at all dispassionate, and their passion enabled the invention of stealth. That passion was needed because stealth faced determined resistance on many levels. On the technical level, a number of engineers, including some of the most legendary names in the aircraft business, thought it couldn't be done. At the corporate level, some managers thought the dubious prospects were not worth a major investment of company finances. At the strategic and political level, some argued there were better ways to solve the problem of Soviet air defenses by flying low and fast, for instance, or using electronic jammers. Engineers at Lockheed and Northrop overcame this resistance to stealth, and this book examines the two programs side by side, revealing key differences in their approaches along with similarities. The differences started with their routes to stealth, one through aircraft, the other more through spacecraft, the latter an important, unrecognized source for stealth. They differed also in their reliance on computers. Computers entered first of all in the design process, where Lockheed leaned heavily on computer codes to analyze radar diffraction, while Northrop depended more on physical intuition. A critical but often less appreciated role for computers stemmed from flight controls, often known as fly-by-wire. Lockheed's first design was unstable in all three directions. One of Northrop's stealth aircraft spun like a weather vane in the yaw axis. Stealth aircraft depended on computers not just for their design, but also to stay in the air. In other words, the key parts of stealth were not just the outside of the plane, the parts you could see, but also the guts inside the plane, the electronics you couldn't see. The stealth program thus represented a momentous change in the aerospace industry, as electrical engineers displaced the old-school aeronautical engineers. And the two firms differed in their embrace of computerized flight control. Finally, the two firms diverged in another disciplinary dispute. Ever since the Wright brothers, aircraft design had been dominated by aerodynamics. Most aircraft designers, including Lockheed's famous Kelly Johnson, came out of aeronautical engineering. For stealth, these aeronautical traditionalists were challenged by physicists and engineers who specialized not in airflow, but in electromagnetic waves. These tensions caused many of the arguments that roiled design offices, but they also proved creative, and their resolution by each firm determined the shape of the airplanes and the outcome of the contests. The two firms, however, also had characteristics in common. One was the shop floor. It was one thing to produce a slick-looking airplane on a blueprint, another thing altogether to turn that into flying hardware. Stealth aircraft were not unique in this regard, but they provide an especially telling example of hardware that pushed beyond existing limits of materials and tooling. Both firms had to integrate design and manufacturing, and both nevertheless struggled to realize their designs. The story of stealth involved machine tools as well as computers and drafting tables, and blue collars as well as white collars. Lockheed and Northrop had one other obvious commonality: geography. Of all the major U.S. aircraft companies, the ones that created stealth aircraft were in Southern California, based 20 miles apart across the L.A. basin. This was not a coincidence. Southern California had long attracted visionaries and dreamers, nourishing a culture of boundary pushing. That creative culture made Southern California more known for the entertainment industry than for aerospace, for Imagineering, not engineering. But aerospace not only underpinned the regional economy, it also tapped the creative entrepreneurial culture, including, as we shall see, some surprising connections between stealth and Disneyland. These themes all came together in two central episodes: the competitions between Lockheed and Northrop for what became the F-117 and the B-2 bomber. But there was an intermediate step between the two planes that has been largely lost to history. Called Tacit Blue, it provided the crucial stepping stone from the flat and faceted F-117 to the curvy B-2 flying wing. It also sparked a connection between the otherwise isolated design teams, one that yielded a surprising source for the flying wing concept. Stealth was a product not only of a particular place, but also of a particular time. Stealth aircraft may have made their public debut in the Gulf War, but the fateful decisions and crucial innovations occurred in the 1970s for reasons both strategic, such as the American experience in the Vietnam War, and technological, including the availability of digital electronic computers, and also, perhaps, cultural. After the seemingly limitless expansion of American economic and military strength after World War II, the 1970s were an uneasy decade of inflation and unemployment, and of declining faith in the government after Vietnam and Watergate. California Governor Jerry Brown called it an era of limits, and in a famous speech in 1979, President Jimmy Carter spoke of a national crisis of confidence, a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. The 1970s were also, however, a time of great political, economic, and cultural ferment, a transition in many ways from post-war America to our post-industrial, globalized world. The tectonic shifts included a burst of technological creativity, some of it with the express aim of overcoming the era's perceived limits, leading to the personal computer, genetic engineering, and stealth. That technological upheaval in turn reflected a broader lesson. Stealth was not just a product of the 1970s, but rather drew on decades of R&D, which itself reflected a national willingness to make long-term investments in uncertain ventures. And those investments came from both the public and the private sectors. Stealth represented a vast integration of the state and private industry, what is commonly called the military-industrial complex. In order to demonstrate the superiority of an unfettered free market over a command economy in the Cold War, the U.S. embraced a strong public-private partnership. The Cold War military-industrial complex often carries negative connotations of a corrupting intrusion of the state into private enterprise, and, in the other direction, of private interests into public policy. And indeed, stealth, as some observers argued, could seem like a waste of money and brain power, enabled by official secrecy and encouraged by pork-barrel politics, all just to produce yet another weapon and a new lap of the arms race. But from a later vantage point, from a time when high-tech boosters insist that the government has no role in innovation, stealth may provide another example of a successful public-private partnership, and it may thus hold enduring lessons. The decisive role of stealth aircraft in the Gulf War demonstrated the fruits of that partnership and popularized talk of a revolution in military affairs, a revolution first glimpsed by Soviet strategists. Soon after the Gulf War, the Soviet Union, the adversary whose presence motivated the invention of stealth, ceased to exist. There is a saying that the Cold War was won in El Segundo, meaning that scientists and engineers, the denizens of El Segundo and other LA aerospace suburbs, won the Cold War by confronting the Soviets with an arms race they couldn't win. Others have argued instead that scientists and engineers prolonged the Cold War by driving the arms race, leading the U.S. to the brink of bankruptcy and the world to the edge of Armageddon. This book will consider both arguments, but it will also present a third view, that stealth offered an alternative to nuclear weapons, a way out of the looking-glass labyrinth of nuclear strategy. Stealth helped launch a reconsideration of strategic fundamentals, albeit one that in the end ran up against the inertia of nuclear strategy. Writing about stealth presents certain challenges. It was one of the nation's most tightly held secrets, although it was also the subject of persistent leaks. Many documents and technical details remain classified, and some stealth workers still refuse to discuss the topic at all. For that reason, some engineers and some historians believe it premature and perhaps fruitless to attempt a history of stealth. Like other aspects of the Cold War, the subject of stealth is too important to wait for that distant day, decades hence, when all the sources are accessible. And aside from some technical details, one can glean much of the story from available sources, including oral histories along with documents. Where these sources present conflicting accounts, I have tried to arrive at the most likely version. I did not set out to write a history of stealth. For several years I have directed the Aerospace History Project, a collaboration between USC and the Huntington Library to document the history of Southern California's aerospace industry. In the course of assembling our aerospace archive, I realized that stealth represented a remarkable story, featuring a cast of interesting characters and raising important issues about modern military technology. I also realized that existing books have not told this story, in part because classification has restricted access to sources. Our project has collected a number of unclassified sources on stealth, in documents and especially in oral histories with a number of key figures at Lockheed and Northrop. While some information about stealth remains classified, for instance the precise radar cross-sections of the F-117 and B-2, the general concepts are now 40 years old, and it is possible to discuss stealth in some technical detail. I have also drawn on sources at other archives that provide new insights on the broader technological and strategic context of the late Cold War. The history of stealth requires dealing with some technical concepts, but I have tried to avoid overwhelming the listener with frequency bands, side lobes, and surface currents, let alone differential equations. Similarly, I have tried not to drown listeners in the alphabet soup of SPOs, FSDs, PDRs, IOCs, and so on that characterizes military program management. Chapter 1. Roots of the Revolution. Stealth is as old as hunting. The need to sneak up on prey or to hide from predators inspired early humans to blend into the landscape, to imitate the animal world, from the leopard spots to the zebra stripes. The French word camouflage, to disguise or conceal, captured some of the idea. Shakespeare understood it. Malcolm's soldiers in Macbeth disguised themselves as trees, Burnham Wood, on their march to Dunsinane. The emergence of modern militaries first brought brightly colored uniforms, thus the British redcoats, to instill pride and distinguish friend from foe. But as the lethal range of weapons increased in the 19th century, armies began shifting to khaki or olive drab to blend in, rather than stand out. Camouflage became prevalent in World War I, including and perhaps especially for aircraft. First, the French and Germans, and then the British and Americans began painting the undersides of airplanes white or pale blue to match the sky, and the topsides with darker greens to match the earth when viewed from above, sometimes throwing in polygons or pointillist patterns to confuse the eye. The wartime effort drew more on artists than on scientists, but late in the war, the U.S. National Research Council organized a committee on aircraft camouflage, led by a civilian physicist named Matthew Lukish, on loan from General Electric. The committee undertook a research program out of Langley Field in Virginia, starting with the assumption that, since the human eye distinguishes objects through differences in brightness and color, an invisible airplane would need the same brightness and color as its background. Moreover, since natural backgrounds often vary in light, shade, and color, patterns would usually be better than uniform tones. But the patterns should still have the same average color and brightness as the background. The committee thus took systematic data on the brightness and hues of land, sky, and water, and on the best sizes and shapes of camouflage patterns. Lukish summarized some of the results in articles entitled "The Visibility of Airplanes," published after the war. The end of the war largely ended these initial forays into invisible aircraft before they settled on an optimum approach. Interest in air defenses faded, and with it the need to hide aircraft. Air power theorists in the 1920s and 1930s instead began talking about the airplane as a decisive, omnipotent weapon. In particular, they viewed strategic bombing, that is, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations and industrial centers, as the key to warfare. As Germany rebuilt its air forces under Hitler, the British realized that airborne bombers posed a dire threat, erasing their traditional defensive advantage as an island nation. In the familiar formulation voiced by former Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin in 1932, "The bomber will always get through." The primary approach to detect incoming aircraft, involving giant concrete acoustic mirrors, could at best pick up bombers at 15 miles, which gave only half the time needed to scramble fighters to intercept them. Baldwin added, regarding the possibility of air defense, "It cannot be done, and there is no expert in Europe who will say it can." In air exercises in 1934, half the bombers in a simulated raid on London reached their targets. But there were, in fact, some experts who said otherwise. In late 1934, the British formed a committee for the scientific survey of air defense, sometimes known as the Tizard Committee after its chairman, scientist Henry Tizard. Its initial focus was a fantastic proposal from Nikola Tesla. Earlier that year, the visionary inventor of electrical and radio devices, now 78 years old and increasingly eccentric, had announced the invention of a particle beam that would destroy airplanes in flight. The so-called death ray, Tesla himself shunned the term, received wide publicity, especially after newspapers reported that the Germans were conducting experiments on it, and that Guglielmo Marconi, another famed inventor, was also working on it. The British committee quickly disproved the death ray idea, including the possibility that high-power radio waves might be used to fry pilots. In the process, however, they stumbled across earlier reports that airplanes flying near radio receivers tended to interfere with the signals. The scientists thought this technique might be applied to detect aircraft, so they cooked up a quick test using a BBC transmitter and an airborne bomber. It worked. The radio waves broadcast by the transmitter hit the airplane, echoed off it, and were picked up by the radio antenna. Within a year, the system could detect planes at a distance of 75 miles. The result, dubbed radar, for radio detection and ranging, was the wonder weapon of World War II. Not only could radar reveal the presence of an airplane, the time between a pulse transmission and reception provided the range, and the direction of the signal yielded the target's altitude and bearing. And radar worked at night and through clouds. It worked even better than the suggestion offered by one enterprising Londoner for finding German bombers at night during the Blitz. Take cat in airplane, aim guns where cat is looking, a proposal apparently not pursued, alas, by the British. The scale of radar research in the U.S. during World War II was bigger than the Manhattan Project. A joint U.S.-British effort pushed radar transmitters to shorter wavelengths, from meters down to a few centimeters, known as the microwave region, for higher target resolution and for antennas small enough to fit on airplanes. The Germans had nothing comparable, and the Japanese lagged even further. Germany had started a radar program at the same time as Britain, but its leaders failed to appreciate its importance. Radar was seen as a defensive weapon, and Hitler wanted offensive weapons, and its program did not enjoy the funding or scientific manpower of the Allied counterpart. Radar proved crucial to the Allied war effort, for submarine and ship detection, airplane and ship navigation, and proximity fuses for anti-aircraft and artillery shells. It helped the Royal Air Force win the Battle of Britain, enabled the strategic bombing of Germany and Japan, and aided the carrier war in the Pacific and the anti-submarine campaign in both theaters. Thus, the common sentiment among both scientists and historians, while the atomic bomb may have ended World War II, radar won it. Radar tilted the balance in the air back toward the defender, but no sooner had radar waves been introduced in combat than each side began trying to counteract them in an early form of electronic warfare. The British and Germans developed countermeasures to jam or spoof enemy radars, leading to the long-running Battle of the Beams in the skies over the English Channel. Both sides also tried radar-absorbing materials on aircraft. The German project was known by the code name Schornsteinfeger, or chimney sweep, because the absorbers often incorporated carbon black. Since submarine periscopes and snorkels stuck out from the ocean surface and appeared on radar displays, the Germans coated them with radar-damping rubber or plastic sheets. At the MIT Radiation Laboratory in the U.S., a team led by Otto Halpern, an émigré Jewish physicist from Austria, developed materials known as HARP, for Halpern anti-radar paint. These were actually more like rubber sheets, with one version for ships and another for aircraft, although the latter, a rubber mat sprinkled with aluminum flakes, was so thin, about 0.025 inches, that it was indeed like a coat of paint. Another Rad Lab invention, called the Salisbury screen after its inventor Winfield W. Salisbury, used a thin reflective sheet, although it only worked for radar waves of a selected wavelength. The Germans also began to develop a remarkable airplane, the Horten 229, a sleek flying wing that seemed to incorporate charcoal as a radar-absorbent coating. The HO-229's resemblance to the later B-2 has sparked speculation that the Germans designed the first stealth airplane, but recent analyses have cast doubt on the use of charcoal, and the Horten designers apparently chose the flying wing not for radar evasion but to enhance aerodynamic performance, the same appeal, we shall see, that the flying wing held for Jack Northrop. As the post-war peace rapidly gave way to the Cold War, the pendulum seemed to swing back in favor of the offense. New jet aircraft made air defense both more difficult and at the same time, because of nuclear bombs, more imperative. The Soviets had a justified fear of surprise attack, having lost some 4,000 planes in the first week of the German invasion in 1941. The Soviets put so much emphasis on air defense that they made it a separate military service known as PVO Strany. From 1945 to the early 1960s, the Soviets spent more on air defenses than they did on nuclear forces. Even after the advent of strategic missiles, they continued to commit enormous resources to air defense, about 15% of the total military budget in the late 1960s and early 1970s, about as much as they spent on their navy. These unknown troops, as one of their commanders called them, developed a series of radar-guided surface-to-air missiles known in the U.S. by the NATO designation SA, starting with the SA-1 in the mid-1950s. The SA-2 made its mark on history by shooting down the high-flying U-2 spy plane of Francis Gary Powers in 1960. The Soviets also developed a defense network against strategic bombers, including a ring of early warning radars, dubbed the Tall King system by NATO, deployed starting in 1959, that could pick up incoming American planes at a distance of 300 miles, which gave them about a half hour to scramble interceptors. With the pendulum swinging back to defense, interest in counteracting radar revived in the U.S. A review at the end of World War II by the Army Air Force's Scientific Advisory Group had struck a pessimistic tone. The study, completed in 1946, was better known as the von Karman Report after the group's chairman, Theodor von Karman, a pioneering aeronautical scientist who had come to the U.S. from Hungary in 1930 to lead Caltech's aeronautical laboratory. The report included a volume on radar, written by several leaders of the American wartime radar effort. It declared that an airplane had too complicated a shape to reduce its radar cross-section, a measure of how big an airplane looks to a radar and therefore how easy it is to detect. It is expressed in terms of area, such as square feet. The report concluded, "We cannot foresee any means by which aircraft..."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?